The cold hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights filled the silence as they handed me a cup of coffee gone bitter with waiting. Daniel Carter here, 38. A teacher who thought a quiet sabbatical in Vermont meant peace, not standing under an old oak, clutching a carved figure I didn't understand. Ever seen a small-town secret unravel before your eyes? Tell me, what would you have done, Daniel? Carter adjusted his coat against the brisk Vermont wind, the familiar scent of wood smoke and pine stirring memories of childhood. The wind tugged at the hem of his jacket as he stepped down from the bus boots, crunching on gravel, lightly dusted with frost. The bus's taillights disappeared around the bend, leaving Daniel alone on the narrow street that led into Maple Hollow. As he stepped off the bus, Martha's letter replayed in his mind. The town hasn't changed much, but you'll find some things harder to ignore this time. He glanced around, drinking in the sights of the little town he hadn't seen in more than a decade. Maple Hollow was exactly as he remembered, maybe even smaller now, framed by pine-covered hills whose tips had already donned white caps of snow. The sun sat low on the horizon, casting amber light across clapboard storefronts and picket fences strung with early holiday garlands. The familiar glow of Ed's Diner neon sign flickered in the corner of his vision, the letters E and N stubbornly dark. A wreath hung crookedly on its door, more festive intention than execution. The soft hum of a radio playing classic country drifted from an open window nearby, mingling with the crisp air. His footsteps echoed lightly as he made his way down Main Street, every boarded-up shop and weathered front porch evoking a memory sneaking penny candy from Geller's General Summer afternoons, fishing at Miller's Creek, autumn bonfires that seemed to warm the whole town. The gentle clang of the bell above the general store's door brought him back to the present. Inside, Martha stood behind the counter, hair more silver than he remembered, but eyes sharp and warm. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she teased, setting aside a basket of yarn. Daniel grinned, stepping forward for a hug that smelled of lavender soap and cinnamon gumdrops. "I wasn't sure if you'd recognize me," he said. "You're still my boy, even under that city coat." Martha's embrace lingered just long enough to erase the years. They chatted easily as she rang up a few items: coffee flour, a jar of her favorite pickles. Neighbors filtered through, offering nods and handshakes. Each welcome home carried an undertone of curiosity. Their glances sliding past him toward the window, where an older man shuffled along the edge of the square, a bundle of something cradled carefully in his arms. Daniel followed their gaze. The man, Walter Grady, if memory served, paused beneath the sprawling oak at the corner of the green. With great care, he knelt and placed a small figure at the base of the tree, straightening it until it stood just so. His hands, bare against the cold, lingered on the figure's head for a moment, before he rose and walked away, his back bent slightly against the wind. "What's he doing?" Daniel asked quietly. Martha's expression softened. "Walter makes that little statue every year. No one dares touch it." The rest of the afternoon passed in the comfortable rhythm of small-town life. Daniel carried Martha's bags as they left the store, stopping to greet old faces: Mr. Jenkins, who once taught shop class; Annie, who ran the post office and remembered his favorite stamps. The pace felt slower here, like the town itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Dinner at Martha's cozy house tasted of home. The roast chicken was tender, the cornbread buttery and warm. They ate by the glow of an old oil lamp conversation, easy meandering from his work in the city to updates on distant cousins. Martha refilled his plate with a knowing smile and slid the last slice of apple pie toward him without asking. Outside, the wind whistled softly, carrying the promise of winter. Later, bundled against the chill, Daniel took a walk through the darkening streets. Porch lights glowed like stars fallen to earth, and somewhere a radio played Blue Moon of Kentucky. The town square was deserted now, save for the oak's bare branches always scraping softly against the sky. There, at its base, stood the figure, a simple wooden carving, no taller than a child's knee, dusted with frost. Daniel paused, inexplicably moved by the figure's humble presence, and glimpsed Walter disappearing into the shadows. He felt the weight of the evening settle around him, questions forming in the silence. The figure seemed to radiate quiet purpose, as if it had been waiting for him to notice all along. What's the story behind him, Daniel wonders as the wind rustles the bare branches. The next morning, steam rose from Daniel's coffee as Martha's warning hung in the air. It's not our place to question Walter. He sat at her worn kitchen table, fingers curled around the warm mug, watching the snow begin to fall beyond the window. The first flurries of the season drifted lazily, dusting the rooftops and bare branches, softening the edges of Maple Hollow. The quiet of the morning wrapped around him like a familiar quilt, but Martha's words echoed louder than the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Daniel stared out at the square where the figure at the oak stood resolute against the encroaching winter. The memory of the night before stayed with him, how the little statue, simple and unadorned, had seemed to stand guard over the empty green, as if holding vigil. There was something about it that felt less like an ornament and more like a promise made long ago, still kept. Bundling into his coat and scarf, Daniel ventured down Main Street, his boots leaving tracks in the thin snow. The town had shifted overnight. Holiday wreaths on shop doors now glistened with frost, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the tang of the cold. He stopped at the general store, where the bell over the door jangled a familiar tune, and the scent of cinnamon and old wood greeted him like an old friend. Inside, Mr. Dobbs polished the glass candy jars at the counter, his round face breaking into a grin when he spotted Daniel. "Mornin', stranger. Settling back in all right?" Daniel returned the smile, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Trying my best. The town feels smaller somehow. Or maybe I just feel bigger." Dobbs chuckled, the sound as warm as the stove crackling in the corner. "That's what the city'll do to a man. Makes his boots too big for our streets." As Daniel selected coffee beans and a loaf of bread, his gaze drifted to the bulletin board by the door flyers for the Thanksgiving dinner at the church. A lost dog notice from July, a curling recipe card for cranberry relish. He hesitated, then asked casually, "I saw Walter yesterday evening, down by the oak. He was placing that little figure. Is that something he's always done?" Mr. Dobbs's hands stilled for a beat, before he resumed stacking tins on a shelf. His tone stayed friendly, but his eyes avoided Daniel's. "Walter's just Walter. Good man. Keeps to himself. Folks here, we let him be." Before Daniel could press, the door opened with a gust of cold, bringing in Reverend Harris, his collar visible beneath a wool scarf. Daniel Carter. "Welcome home, son." His handshake was firm, his smile genuine. "We could use a good hand at the church kitchen this week. Thanksgiving's coming quick, and Mrs. Parker's already fretting about pies." Daniel found himself nodding. "I'd be glad to help. It'd be nice to feel useful." "Bless you," Harris said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Come by tomorrow morning. We'll set you to work." As the Reverend departed with his bag of flour, Daniel noticed an elderly woman at the counter, silver hair tucked beneath a knit cap, watching him with eyes both kind and cautious. She leaned closer to Mr. Dobbs, voice low but not low enough. "His wife was a saint. We all owe her, that's why." The words carried the weight of history of debts remembered long after the ledgers closed. Daniel paid for his goods, the creak of the floorboards beneath him echoing his thoughts. Outside, the snow had thickened, softening the edges of the square. He walked past the oak again, slowing as he noticed small tokens scattered near the base: pine cones, a candle stub, a sprig of cedar. None touched the figure itself. Even now it stood alone, untouched, as if the townsfolk feared to disturb whatever promise it represented. The rest of the day passed in quiet purpose. Daniel visited the community center where women folded napkins and discussed recipes, their chatter filled with the comfort of tradition. He offered to help set up chairs, feeling the town's rhythm begin to seep into his bones. The air smelled of yeast rolls rising and coffee percolating, and for the first time since his arrival, he felt less like an outsider and more like a returning son. Dusk came early, the sky heavy with more snow to come. As Daniel made his way home, the lamps along Main Street flickered on, casting warm pools of light on the sidewalks. His breath clouded before him, and his boots crunched in the fresh fall. The figure at the oak seemed to catch the last of the light, standing sentinel as always. Daniel walks home resolved, I need to understand this man before I judge him. The path crunched beneath Daniel's boots as he followed faint tracks toward the woods, dusk settling like a soft blanket. Each step took him farther from the glow of Maple Hollow's street lamps, their warm halos swallowed by the darkening trees. The air smelled of pine and cold earth, the kind of clean, crisp scent that filled his lungs and cleared his mind. Snow clung to the underbrush in small patches, and the first stars began to blink through the bare branches overhead. Daniel kept his pace slow, careful not to disturb the quiet that had fallen. He couldn't say what had drawn him from the comfort of Martha's house that evening. Perhaps it was the figure at the oak, untouched and solemn, or the weight of the townsfolk's silence that felt heavier than the snow-laden air. Whatever it was, it led him now toward the woods at the edge of town, where faint tracks disappeared into the trees, and a flicker of lantern light glowed like a firefly in the distance. As he drew nearer, the steady sound of a knife against wood reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic scraping that blended with the sigh of the wind. Daniel paused just beyond a thicket, watching, as the lantern's glow revealed Walter Grady seated on a stump, his shoulders hunched against the cold. The old man's hands worked with quiet precision, a small block of wood cradled in his palm, as the blade shaped it into something more than what it had been. Walter's breath clouded in the frosty air, the lantern's flicker casting long shadows across his lined face. His coat was patched in places, the kind of garment kept long beyond its best years, out of loyalty or necessity. Nearby, a cloth bundle held his tools, a few worn knives, a file, and a tin of oil that caught the lantern's glint. Daniel stood for a moment longer, unwilling to intrude on the scene, then cleared his throat gently. Walter didn't startle, only glanced up with eyes that held both caution and a quiet kind of patience. Evening. Daniel offered his voice low so as not to disturb the peace between them. Walter inclined his head slightly, the knife pausing only for a heartbeat before resuming its work. The scraping continued steady as a heartbeat. Daniel took a few slow steps forward, stopping at a respectful distance where the lantern's glow barely touched his boots. "Didn't mean to bother you," Daniel said, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "I saw the light. Thought I'd see who was out this way." Walter said nothing at first, the knife's rhythm filling the space between them. When he spoke, his voice was rough, but not unkind. "Plenty of folks don't come this far." Daniel nodded, the truth of it plain. The woods seemed to stand as a boundary few cared to cross. "I've always liked it out here. Reminds me of when I was a kid. Used to think these trees had secrets." Walter's mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile, though his eyes stayed on the piece of wood in his hand. The figure began to take shape, a simple form, the curve of a shoulder, the suggestion of folded hands. Daniel didn't comment on it, sensing that words might break whatever fragile accord had settled over them. A long minute passed before Walter spoke again. "You're Martha's grandson." Daniel blinked in surprise, then smiled. "That obvious." "Same eyes," Walter murmured. He set down the carving and flexed his fingers' joints stiff from the cold. Daniel shifted his weight, noticing then a small locket resting beside Walter's tools. The silver caught the lantern's light, and without meaning to, Daniel's gaze lingered. The locket was open, and inside was a photograph, faded edges worn, but clear enough to see a woman's gentle smile, her eyes bright with life long past. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind stirred the branches overhead, and somewhere in the distance an owl called softly. Daniel felt the weight of the quiet of all the things left unsaid. Walter's voice broke the stillness softer than before. "It's for her. Always for her." Daniel wiped frost from the library window, watching as snowflakes began to dance in the gray November sky. The glass felt cold beneath his palm, the kind of cold that seeped through wool gloves and into the bones. Outside, Maple Hollow's streets blurred beneath the falling snow, shop signs and wreaths softened by the gentle onslaught. Inside, the library hummed with quiet purpose, the tick of the wall clock, the whisper of turning pages, and the faint crackle of the old radiator doing its best against the chill. Walter's quiet words, "It's for her, always for her," haunted his thoughts. The simple sincerity of that admission echoed louder than any town gossip, more poignant than all the side glances and hushed tones. Daniel turned from the window and crossed to a table near the back, where Mrs. Ellis, the librarian, had laid out bound volumes of old newspapers at his request. The scent of aged paper and pine garlands filled the air, comforting and familiar. Mrs. Ellis gave him a small, knowing smile as she settled behind the desk again, her silver hair tucked into a loose braid. "If it's history you're after, you'll find it in there," she said gently. Daniel nodded his thanks and opened the first volume, the pages fragile beneath his fingers. Hours seemed to slip away as he read the world outside the library, reduced to snow and silence. There it was, the winter storm that had ravaged the area nearly 40 years ago. Headlines spoke of drifts higher than rooftops, power lost for days, entire roads swallowed by ice and wind. And then the story that stopped him cold: local woman Elizabeth Grady perished after rescuing 2 children stranded near the old mill road. The article detailed her heroism, the town's grief, and mentioned Walter only in passing, a widower left behind in the storm's wake. Daniel closed the volume, hands resting on the worn leather cover, heart heavy with understanding. That simple figure Walter carved year after year, it was for her. A promise carved in wood, renewed with each winter's return. And somehow, the town had let that act of remembrance become a thing whispered about rather than honored. Later that afternoon, Daniel made his way through the thickening snow to the church, where the basement glowed warm and golden. The scent of pumpkin pies cooling on the windowsill mingled with the savory tang of roasted turkey. The creak of old chairs and the clink of cutlery being laid out filled the air, underscored by the soft murmur of conversation. He joined Reverend Harris and a handful of others in setting long tables, their surfaces covered in white cloths, trimmed with lace yellowed by age but cared for with devotion. As Daniel worked, he noticed how the townsfolk came alive in the preparations, smiles, easy hands, steady in familiar tasks. And yet, beneath the comfort of tradition, he felt the gap where Walter should have been. No one spoke his name, but his absence felt as present as the storm clouds gathering outside. Martha arrived later, cheeks pink from the cold, carrying a basket of biscuits still warm from her oven. They worked side by side for a while, the rhythm of folding napkins and arranging centerpieces soothing in its simplicity. When they paused, Daniel glanced at her, the question forming before he could stop it. "Martha," he said quietly, "why didn't the town do more? After what she did, what he lost?" Martha's hands stilled her gaze fixed on the table before her. For a moment he thought she might deflect as others had, but she sighed, the sound soft as falling snow. "We failed him, Daniel. Maybe we didn't mean to." Folks didn't know how to face their own guilt, so they turned their eyes elsewhere. And Walter, he never asked for anything, just kept to himself, carving those figures, keeping his promise. A radio crackled from the corner, drawing their attention. The announcer's voice, tinny and urgent, filled the room. "Severe snowstorm advisory for tonight. Residents urged to prepare. Accumulation expected to exceed forecasts. Please stay off roads and check on neighbors." Daniel looked out at the gathering clouds, heart heavy. History's about to repeat itself. Night fell fast, and the wind began to howl through the streets of Maple Hollow. The storm descended like a living thing, fierce and unrelenting, the kind of blizzard that swallowed sounds and shapes alike. Snow whipped sideways beneath flickering streetlights, piling in knee-deep drifts that transformed familiar paths into treacherous ground. The houses that lined Main Street huddled against the wind, their windows dark, where power had failed, shadows pooling behind curtains, drawn tight against the cold. Inside Martha's home, Daniel worked alongside her to bank the fire and secure the shutters. The wind rattled them anyway, as if determined to find a way in. The air inside smelled of damp wool and wood smoke, the sense of resilience. Martha's face was pale but determined, her hands steady as she handed Daniel extra blankets. "Don't think of going out there, Daniel," she warned, though the worry in her eyes told him she knew he would. "I have to see if anyone needs help," he said gently, wrapping his scarf high against his face. The memory of Walter's wife, of the sacrifice she'd made of kindness, left unspoken, pressed heavy on his heart. He couldn't sit and do nothing. Martha said nothing more, only squeezed his hand before he stepped out into the blinding snow. The storm enveloped him the moment the door shut behind him, the wind tugging at his coat, the cold biting through every layer. He moved carefully, boots crunching through drifts, lantern in hand. The streets he'd walked so easily by daylight were now a maze of white and shadow. But here and there, shapes emerged, neighbors, helping neighbors, bundled figures moving together toward the church, where warmth and safety waited. And at the heart of it all was Walter. Daniel spotted him first, near the general store lantern, held high, his voice low, but firm, as he guided an elderly couple through the snow. Walter's coat flapped in the wind, his cap dusted white, but his movements were sure, his calm, a steadying force amid the chaos. Without fanfare or command, he led group after group toward the shelter, returning again and again into the storm's teeth. At the church, Daniel found the basement alive with flickering lantern light and the murmur of frightened voices. Walter moved quietly among them, arranging blankets, checking windows, making sure the youngest and oldest were nearest the stove. He worked with quiet efficiency, never raising his voice, never seeking thanks. Daniel joined in where he could, handing out dry socks, fetching water, watching as slowly the fear in the room gave way to a fragile sense of safety. Outside, the storm showed no sign of relenting. Walter led Daniel and two others in checking nearby buildings, ensuring no one was left behind. The cold stung Daniel's face, his breath freezing in the air. But Walter pressed on his strength, drawn from a well Daniel couldn't yet fathom. Hours passed in a blur of snow and lantern light. When the wind howled loudest and the church walls groaned beneath its force, a loud crack split the night. The shelter's side beam, weakened by time and storm, buckled inward. For a heartbeat, panic threatened to overtake the room. But then Walter was there, bracing his shoulder against the beam, his boots sliding in the snow, tracked in from outside, his arms straining to hold the weight. "Get something to shore it up," he called, his voice rough with effort but steady. Daniel and two others scrambled, hauling timbers from the storeroom, reinforcing the wall, until the groaning ceased, and the church stood solid once more. Walter sagged against the wood chest, heaving, but he straightened soon after, casting a quick glance around to ensure all was well. His eyes met Daniel's briefly, and in that moment, Daniel saw not the quiet recluse the town had whispered about for years, but the man beneath, a man of quiet strength of duty, lived out in deeds rather than words. Daniel watches Walter, thinking, this is what true strength looks like. Morning sunlight spilled across the snow, turning Maple Hollow into a world of white and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind drifts that softened the edges of fences and rooftops, but the air was still almost reverent. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the scent of wood fires mingled with the faint aroma of coffee carried on the breeze. The square glistened as if it had been touched by magic, the kind born of survival and shared struggle. Daniel stood at the edge of the square, gazing at the oak where this all began. He recalled his first sight of the figure there, how he'd stared at it, puzzled, not seeing beyond its simple form. How little he'd understood then. The town's history, Walter's grief, the quiet strength of promises kept year after year. Now he saw with new eyes. The townsfolk gathered slowly, drawn out by the clear morning and the unspoken pull of purpose. Families arrived, bundled in coats and scarves, cheeks pink from the cold arms laden with covered dishes, thermoses of coffee, and baskets of pine cones and candles. The church bells chimed the hour, their sound bright in the crisp air. There was a hum of conversation, soft talk of the storm's force of roofs that would need mending, of gratitude that no one had been lost. The undercurrent was one of change, of something right being set straight. Daniel helped organize the gathering, working alongside Reverend Harris and Martha, who carried a tray of pumpkin muffins still warm beneath a cloth. Tables were set near the oak, spread with pies, breads, and steaming pots of cider. Children darted about, their laughter ringing clear, their energy unbroken by the storm's memory. Walter came last, his step slow but sure, the new figure he'd carved cradled in his arms. The townsfolk parted to let him through, and for the first time in many years, they met his eyes without hesitation or shame. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just neighbors together doing what felt right. They helped him place the figure at the base of the oak, the wood catching the sunlight, so that for a moment it seemed to glow from within. One by one, people added their offerings, pine cones arranged in careful circles, candles lit and placed gently in the snow, dishes shared and passed among cold hands. Coffee thermoses were opened, the rich dark scent rising into the air as cups were filled and passed with murmured thanks. Pie slices were cut and shared their sweetness, a small balm after bitter days. Walter stood quietly, taking it all in. His eyes glistened as he watched the children lay pine cones and candles around the figure, their small hands respectful in their task. "She'd have liked this," he whispered, voice rough with emotion that no longer needed to be hidden. Daniel watched him, heart full. He'd come to Maple Hollow seeking reconnection and found instead a lesson in grace. As the morning wore on, as the town shared food and stories, as fences, both real and imagined, melted beneath the sun's warmth, he thought of that first wooden figure, of what it had represented to him then, and what it meant now. Maybe the real figure we needed to move was the one in our hearts. In the quiet of Thanksgiving morning, the townsfolk stood together beneath the old oak, their breath mingling in the crisp air, their hearts lighter than they'd been in years. The simple figure they placed with Walter became more than wood and memory. It became a symbol of the kindness that had always been there, waiting to be seen. True compassion often wears humble shapes, and when we pause to look past our judgments, We find strength and grace in unexpected places. Like the soft glow of a lantern on a snowy night, even the smallest act of understanding can guide us through life's darkest storms. If this story stirred something in you, may it inspire you to offer quiet kindness where it's needed most.